A Chinese rescue helicopter flew a line over the Himalaya on Thursday, and the camera in its belly pointed down at something that should not have been there. Brown water. A lot of it. Sitting in a basin high in the mountains, filling a place that 2 days earlier had been a stream bed and some scrub. The bushes were already under. The tops of trees were breaking the surface like the last few fence posts in a rising field. And at the downstream end of all that water, there was a wall of rock and mud and shattered ice, and the water was pushing against it. What the camera could not find was an outlet. No river leaving, no channel cutting away downhill, just water arriving and a barrier holding it and no obvious way out. That footage is why this story is not over. 2 days ago, the Himalaya sent a wall of water into Nepal and killed hundreds of people. The water has passed, the river has dropped, but the thing that caused it left something behind up in the mountains, and China's Ministry of Water Resources has now put a number and a deadline on it. So stay with this one, because I want to walk you through exactly what is sitting above that valley right now, what the engineers are doing about it in the next 72 hours, and the one thing almost every headline is getting wrong about what a barrier lake actually does. If you want the follow-up when the next satellite pass comes in, the subscribe button is right there and it costs you nothing. Here is the shape of the problem. When you build a dam on purpose, you build it to hold. You survey the rock, you compact the fill-in layers. You design a spillway before you design anything else, because the spillway is the part that saves the dam. The whole structure exists to manage water leaving as much as water arriving. The mountain built this one by accident. A mass of ice and rock came off a glacier, fell into a narrow valley, and stopped moving. That is the entire construction process. Seconds long. No survey, no compaction, no spillway, no plan. Whatever was falling became the dam, arranged in whatever order gravity happened to drop it. And accidents do not come with blueprints, which means nobody can look at that pile from the outside and tell you what is holding it together. The valley in question is the Lhende Khola, a small tributary high on the Nepal and China border. Small is the word to hold on to. This is not a major river. It is a mountain stream, and normally you would never hear about it. But it feeds the Botakoshi, and the Botakoshi is the main upper tributary of the Trishuli, and the Trishuli runs south through some of the most densely settled river valleys in central Nepal. A blockage on a stream nobody has heard of sits at the top of a plumbing system that ends in towns of tens of thousands of people. And there is not one blockage. There are 2 reported lakes on either side of that border, and they are not the same feature. The one China is warning about sits near where the Chochin Khola meets the Purput Sangpo. As of Thursday morning, the Ministry of Water Resources put its volume at about 2 million cubic meters. That number needs translating, because 2 million cubic meters means nothing to a human being. Picture a solid cube of water, 126 meters on every side. Taller than a 40-story building, and just as deep and just as wide. That is what is standing behind a pile of rubble that assembled itself in less time than it takes to read this sentence. And it is already overflowing. Water is going over the top. The lake Nepal's disaster authority flagged is a different measurement entirely. The NDRRMA used satellite images from Planet Labs and Landsat received late Thursday morning and found a body of water covering about 0.11 square kilometers, sitting roughly 18 kilometers upstream of the Rasuwagadhi border crossing. 0.11 square kilometers is around 15 football pitches of standing water where a mountain stream used to run. And the authorities' language about the natural dam holding it back was blunt. Stability uncertain. 18 kilometers of steep descending channel is not much distance when the thing traveling it is falling downhill the entire way. Now, before we go further into what happens next, you have to understand what already came down this valley, because it sets the stake for everything that follows. Wednesday morning, around 9 o'clock, without heavy rain and without warning, a surge came down the Botakoshi into Rasuwa district. It went through Timure, it went through Saya Frubisi, it took out roads, bridges, buildings, hydropower infrastructure, and the border crossing at Rasuwagadhi. On the Chinese side, it hit Gyirong County, also written as Gyirong, where the land port that connects China and Nepal was wiped out, there had been no storm. That detail is the one that separates this from the monsoon flooding Nepal plans for every single year. Nepal's rivers rise in the monsoon. Everyone knows that. Everyone watches the gauges. But this arrived on a normal morning from a mechanism that gauges do not measure. The toll as of Friday stands at 469 confirmed dead, according to Nepal police, with hundreds still missing as search teams work their way down the river system. Bodies have been recovered across Rasuwa, Nuwakot, Dading, Gorkha, Chitwan, Tanahun, and Nawalparasi. Nearly 1,000 people remain unaccounted for on both sides of the border, and among them are as many as 540 foreign nationals from 31 different countries, many of them travelers and pilgrims who happened to be on that corridor on a Wednesday morning in August. Nepal has more than 13,000 security personnel deployed in the search, a small city's worth of people walking riverbanks and debris fields. Helicopters have been flying whenever the weather allows them to, and the weather has not been generous. So when Chinese and Nepali authorities say there is a risk of a second flood, they are saying it to people who are standing in the wreckage of the first one. Here is the clock. China's water ministry expects another 3 million cubic meters of water to flow into that barrier lake over 3 days. Reuters put that figure at roughly 1,200 Olympic swimming pools. Try it a different way. If you poured 3 million cubic meters onto a standard football pitch and gave it walls, the water would stand more than 400 meters deep. That is the water arriving on top of the water already there, behind a barrier nobody designed. Peak inflow is expected around the 1st of September. That is the date. That is why this window matters, and why the next few days are the story. And the reason the water keeps coming is not mysterious. It is monsoon season in Nepal, June through September, and the country takes roughly 80% of its annual rainfall in that window. Thunderstorms are in the forecast across the region. Some places will get several inches in a few hours, some places will stay dry. Nobody can tell you in advance which valley draws the heavy cell, and the catchment feeding this lake does not need a record-breaking storm to keep filling. It just needs an ordinary monsoon week. Zhu Jinfeng, a hydrology researcher at the ministry, told Chinese state television that the volume of water keeps increasing and so does the risk. That is a technical sentence delivered flatly, and it is one of the more alarming things anyone has said this week. Now, who is standing in the path? The first answer is the rescuers. This is the part that keeps catching me when I look at the map. The people searching the Lhende and Bodakoshi corridor for the missing are working inside the exact channel that a second surge would use. Chinese authorities have flagged that a breach could bring renewed flooding and damage downstream, including the Gyirong port area, and that it would put their own emergency responders at risk. Evacuation orders have gone out for the port. ICIMOD, the mountain research center based in Kathmandu, confirmed those orders on Wednesday. On the Nepali side, high alerts are in place across Rasuwa, Nuwakot, Dading, Gorkha, and Chitwan, and residents along the Bodakoshi, Trishuli, and Narayani rivers have been told to stay off the banks while water levels remain unpredictable. Nepal's disaster authority told residents and rescue workers alike to stay away from the riverbanks and stay on high alert. India has begun mobilizing National Disaster Response Force teams as a precaution because these rivers do not stop at borders and the Narayani becomes the Gandak once it crosses south. If you have ever lived somewhere with a river alert system, you know how much of this comes down to a single behavior. Not sandbags, not sirens, distance from the channel. Have you ever been told to evacuate for water? I want to know how much warning you actually got, because in this valley on Wednesday the answer was close to none, and it is worth comparing. Right, now the part that most of the coverage is skipping, and the part that will tell you whether to be worried or watchful. Could does not mean will. The phrase in every headline is high risk of a breach. That phrasing is accurate and it comes from a ministry that is monitoring the site around the clock. But a barrier lake failing is not a single yes or no event, and the most common outcome for a debris-dammed lake is not the one people picture. Water tops the barrier, finds a soft line through it, and starts cutting. The channel widens over hours or days. The lake drains, sometimes messily, sometimes with a surge, and often without the catastrophic wall of water that the phrase dam burst puts in your head. That process has already started here, because the ministry says the lake is overflowing. Overflowing is the beginning of the drainage story, not the end of it. The danger scenario is different. The danger is when a barrier holds long enough to build a large head of water and then loses structural integrity all at once, so the whole volume leaves in minutes instead of days. Whether this particular pile does that depends on things nobody can see from a helicopter, how deep the rubble goes, whether there is ice buried inside it that will melt and take the strength with it, how fine the material is, whether there are void spaces where water is already moving through the dam rather than over it. And this is the honest core of the situation. No engineer has stood on that dam. The access is genuinely dangerous. One of the Chinese engineers on the survey team described the site to state television as ringed with isolated and steep cliffs that appeared after the glacier collapse created the lake. So what exists is satellite imagery, helicopter footage, and modeling. What does not exist is a person with instruments standing on the crest of that barrier telling you what it is made of. Anyone giving you a confident prediction about this lake right now is giving you a guess wearing a suit. There is a real precedent, and it cuts both ways. In October of 2018, a landslide dammed the Jinsha River at Baige, on the border between Sichuan and Tibet. That lake breached, and it was survivable. Then a second landslide in November rebuilt the barrier higher, with far more water behind it. Chinese engineers did not wait. They cut an overflow channel into the crest of the barrier so the breach would trigger at a lower water level and on their timing rather than the mountains. The dam still failed. The peak discharge measured about 31,000 cubic meters per second, which is somewhere near twice the average flow of the Mississippi River where it reaches the sea, and nearly 75,000 people had already been moved out of the way. That is the lesson worth holding. The dam broke anyway. The engineering did not stop the flood. What the engineering and the evacuation did was change who was standing there when it arrived, which is exactly what is happening now. An 8-member Chinese engineering team is running aerial surveys and building a 3-dimensional model of the barrier, and the Water Ministry has been running flood simulations to work out what a breach would do downstream and where responders should and should not be. China activated a Level 4 flood emergency response on Thursday. The modeling is not academic. It determines whether rescue crews stay in the channel or pull back to high ground and how far downstream the alert has to reach. Nepal's authority is watching its own lake by satellite, comparing successive passes to see whether that 0.11 square kilometers is growing, holding, or shrinking. A shrinking lake means the barrier is leaking and doing its job of draining slowly. A growing lake means the opposite. Now step back, because there is a pattern underneath this that matters more than any single week. This is the second time in 14 months that the Lhende Khola has flooded catastrophically. On the 8th of July, 2025, a superglacial lake burst high inside Tibet, about 35 kilometers north of Rasuwagadhi, at an altitude near 5,150 meters, which is close to 16,900 feet. That flood swept away the Friendship Bridge and closed the border crossing entirely. Nepal's Department of Hydrology and Meteorology traced it by measuring the lake before and after, and found it had shrunk from about 0.74 square kilometers to around 0.60. The water had gone somewhere, and everyone downstream knew where. Twice in 14 months, in the same small tributary from 2 different high mountain mechanisms. That is not a coincidence you can shrug off. That is a channel telling you what it is. And here is where I want to be careful with you, because this is exactly the point where the internet stops being useful. You will find people this week stating flatly that climate change caused Wednesday's flood. The scientists closest to the data are not saying that. ICIMOD specialists were explicit that while warming is changing glaciers, snow, permafrost, and slope stability across the Hindu Kush Himalaya, it is too early to determine what role climate change played in this specific event. Attribution for a single avalanche takes months of work, not days. What is established is broader and, honestly, harder to dismiss. Himalayan glaciers are losing mass. Permafrost that has been gluing rock faces together for centuries is thawing. Slopes that were stable are becoming less stable, and the number of high mountain hazard events across the region is climbing. One of ICIMOD's cryosphere specialists put it plainly, saying the pace of change is outrunning the efforts to keep up with it. So the trend is real, the specific attribution is pending, and both of those things can be true at the same time. That distinction is not a technicality, it is the difference between science and a slogan. The suspected trigger for Wednesday is an ice and rock avalanche off a glacier, dropping into the Lhende Khola and damming it. The blockage held. Then it did not. What came downstream was not a river rising over its banks. It was a release. Seismic instruments even caught it, with the United States Geological Survey cataloging a magnitude 5.2 landslide signal northwest of Kodari. The mountain announced itself on an earthquake network. So what do you actually watch over the next few days? Watch the 1st of September. That is when peak inflow into the Chinese flagged lake is expected, and it is the date the Water Ministry's own timeline points at. Watch for updated volume figures. 2 million cubic meters is Thursday's number, and the useful question is not how big it is, but which direction it is moving between one satellite pass and the next. Watch for the word excavation. If Chinese engineers announce they are cutting a controlled channel into that barrier, it means they have decided a managed release beats waiting, and it means they have modeled a breach they do not like. Watch the evacuation footprint on both sides. If the alert zone extends further downstream into Nuwakot and Dating, the modeling has produced a bigger number than the public one. And watch the rainfall, because every heavy cell over that catchment moves the schedule forward. 469 people are confirmed dead. Close to 1,000 are still missing, and families in more than 30 countries are waiting on a phone call. The search teams are in the channel right now, working under a lake that nobody has been able to walk up to and inspect. The water from Wednesday has already passed. The next decision belongs to a pile of rock that fell off a mountain by accident, and nobody gets to negotiate with it. I will be tracking the volume updates and the engineering call as they come in, so subscribe and turn the bell on if you want the next reading when the September 1st window opens. This one is not finished.